Hey everyone, I'm so excited about this new faith-driven leader series for the On the Rise podcast, where we're going to be interviewing various leaders that are connected to real estate and connected to our company to learn how we integrate our faith into our everyday work. I think there's a lot of people that want to incorporate their faith more into their daily lives, into their rhythms and rituals of life. We're going to be interviewing people to see those moments in their life where they've been at an inflection point, a critical business decision, a new opportunity, a trial that they've had to overcome, and how their faith helped them navigate that challenge.
Welcome to the On the Rise podcast, where we talk about time freedom, passive investing through real estate, finance, and mindset. Let's dive in. Quick disclaimer as always, I am not a CPA, I am not an attorney or a financial advisor. This is not financial advice. I am not telling you or anyone else what to do. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are provided for education and informational purposes only and are not necessarily the views of my employer.
Welcome to the On the Rise podcast. This is the Faith-Driven Leader Series. My name is Nick Stromwall, your host. I'm really excited to be bringing on guests who are leaders in various industries connected to real estate to really learn how to integrate their faith into their everyday work. Today, we have the privilege of welcoming on our very first guest, Jeremy Dyer.
Yeah, Nick, really excited to have this conversation with you. Thanks for having me on the inaugural episode.
So could you just kind of unpack and tell our audience a little bit more about who you are?
My background is such that I really predominantly grew up, in a small neighborhood in St. Paul, Minnesota. My parents ended up getting divorced when I was 6 years old. I was largely really a latchkey kid, from the time that I was basically 8 or 9, years old. I was kind of left up to my, really my own devices. I would come home from school, for example, to an empty house. I'd wake up in the morning, and really be responsible for getting myself going for the day. Of course, the summers, when I was growing up, I was largely, left up to my, own devices. So fill in the blanks there, right? And so I really, learned kind of at a very early age, this kind of concept of self-reliance, independent thinking, but at the same token, I had this kind of internal drive, of achievement. And for me anyways, growing up, that's where really I found my identity, my self-worth, my value, was really predominantly wrapped up into, my achievement and my drive and my kind of ability to make mistakes and kind of clean them up later, kind of a thing. So I'll never forget, back in the fourth grade, Nick, I had accumulated so many check marks next to my name. This is back in the chalkboard days, right? I'd accumulated so many check marks, next to my name, which was not a good thing, by the way, that there wasn't enough time, otherwise known as detentions, to serve out my entire rest of my fourth grade year in elementary school because the school year was over at that point. So it was really a challenge for me kind of growing up. I was always kind of seeking, after this, recognition, but recognition in a negative way. And so really it got to the point where I entered into junior high. My mother had remarried. My father was always a big part of my own life. And my stepfather really came alongside me as a man figure in my life and really surrounded, his love of me, right? And really gave me kind of a masculine identity, a masculine purpose, and really encouraged and called me, up into something bigger and better. And so I'll never forget, really I get into, my high school days, and all of a sudden I kind of transferred this recognition of others in a negative way. I transferred into a recognition and praise of others, right? So it was really, kind of late into my high school, days in school, where at that same token, I started to explore my faith. I really predominantly grew up as a Catholic, family, which really was Catholic in name only. We were predominantly, what I would call a holiday churchgoer, right? My experience in church and my experience of God really only occurred on either Easter morning or perhaps maybe on a Christmas Eve service, right? But the extent of it, that was basically it, other than funerals and of course weddings. And so it was really back in kind of my high school days where I started to explore my faith further. and had the opportunity to attend a local church where I grew up. And it was really at that time, after having been exposed to the difference of those that were a part of the church, which really inspired me to want to get to know more about the faith that they had in Jesus Christ. And so it was really, kind of that later couple of years of high school and early part of college where I surrendered my life to Jesus at that time and really found my new, life heroes in the actual church themselves. And I realized at that time that my faith was not just a religion, but it was an actual relationship, with our maker. And so I really like to tell people, kind of during my college days, I really traded, a college fraternity for men's fraternity groups in our local church. I traded, college rush week, for youth ministry, missions, and mentors, and really traded kind of this kind of college life, for Christian worldview weekends and, learning service and surrender and this kind of constant pruning, which a major pruning part, of course, took place back in those early days as a new believer. And really now, as I've gotten older, I realized, wow, it's not maybe a massive pruning process, but the pruning process continues to take place, in my own life on literally a daily basis.
That's amazing. It's amazing to see everyone's story is so unique when it comes to their faith journey, how they grew up, at what point did they maybe have the awakening or the time where faith really became real. What was it for you that, if you had to say maybe before having a real faith or a real trust in Jesus, what was the turning point for you?
Yeah, I would say honestly, Nick, it was the power of the way in which God works through people. Okay. It was really the people that God placed into my life, where I recognize there's something different with people that are professing to have a faith and a belief in Jesus as their God and their creator and really the sustainer of their lives. And it was really that really, I would say it even inspired me to have a hunger to want to know more about this real living faith that these individuals had in God. Because for me, it was merely intellectual at first. But when I started to see that people had a real living faith in their maker and a relationship with God, it was really that really inspired me to want to know more. And I really saw something different in the faith-based community that I just simply was not seeing in the, public school system or in the, college universities, the secular universities that were out there. And so it was really kind of that relationship that the local church had with God that really was the catalyst to me desiring to want to know more.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing how when you see or experience the aroma of other people and how they interact and what they do, it just makes you kind of sometimes wonder what is it that they have, and if what they have seems so good, how do I get it? What was that process like for you to maybe experience that from other people and then want it yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously it manifested itself in a couple of different conversations. One being from the main pulpit. Our preaching pastor at the time, gave those that were listening to his message, and his message was very simple. It was a salvation message, right? And he really gave people the opportunity, at the end of that salvation message, to accept Jesus Christ into their lives if they hadn't previously done so. And for me, it was really up here in my head, and he was really calling us to take that head knowledge and make it a heart relationship with him, right? So it was really at that time that I made that initial decision. And then I'll never forget, shortly thereafter, meeting with our youth pastor, and him explaining to me, kind of, as it relates to, our new life in Christ now, it's a constant pruning process. It's a relationship that we have with our maker, and there's sin in our lives that needs to be dealt with, right? Jesus Christ paid the price for our sins for all of time, and offers that, salvation, for us, and that forgiveness, through his death on the cross. But there's a lot of things in my own life that I need to clean up. And so he kind of explained it to me that, Satan is like a big booger and his demons are like snot, right? And you really need to turn over that power to God in your life to be able to deal with those boogers and those snots, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think for a lot of people, they do grow up, culturally in their family having gone to some type of church, and it becomes more of a ritual than any type of realness. Um, And I think there's an experience that a lot of people go through where they want to make it real and they just need someone to help them along the process, whether it's a friend, a local church, or even another business leader. And part of the reason that I wanted to help start this podcast is because I think there's a lot of people in the workforce right now that their faith, their family, maybe their fitness, their finances, the different F's that a lot of people often talk about, are really important, but they need a guide. They need a playbook. They need to see how other people are living out their faith in everyday life. I came from a ministry background where my job was meeting with people, engaging them with the truths of the Bible and what a relationship with Christ would look like. And in the working world, I kind of find this analogy of you start with the external, sports and weather. What are the big events happening in the world? And then you get to go, as you develop a relationship with someone, moving into the internal. How you doing? What was that experience like? You just went through this significant trial. How are you doing? And then if God grants the ability to turn the corner to go to the internal. So you start with the external, you go to the internal, and then you move to the eternal. What's that been like for you, being a leader, a faith-driven leader in various organizations, over these last 30 years? How do you incorporate your faith in your work?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, and I think it's important for obviously everybody to understand, and most people know that your faith is a journey, right? It's a constant refinement. It's almost like we're being saved daily, right? Kind of a thing. This constant renewal, of your mind. And I spent a lot of years early on in my tech sales journey, really crushing it, for 25 years in the high tech sales space, and I had peak performance, in the eyes of other people, my colleagues. I was winning awards and I was crushing goals of all kinds. They couldn't have a carrot big enough, for me to chase after, kind of a thing. And Nick, while I was having all of this outward, success, I really had a lot of inward restlessness. I was winning at work, but I was losing spiritually, right? And it makes me kind of think about, that song, by, I think it's Mark Hall, called The American Dream. It's, by Casting Crowns. So I kind of had my Casting Crowns, moment. And, in the song, Mark tells the story about a man who's chasing this worldly success at the expense of his family and his faith. And in the song, he talks about, because he works all day, he builds with his own two hands, he pours all he has into this castle, made with sand, which he says then further, I would rather take a shack on a rock over a castle in the sand, right? And so it's really this kind of shift that I had to go through, while I was crushing it according to the world standards and my colleague standards, really the shift from, success to significance, and now priorities and faith and legacy, right? And so that's why I say, I think, we're constantly, we constantly almost have to have an altar call, in our lives on a daily basis. Being saved is something that is an ongoing thing. It's not a one and done, event. And sometimes when we go through, a season of uncertainty, we may need to be stripped of our worldly identity, right? And refind our worth and our purpose in Christ, and know that our worth and our purpose is not in performance as it relates to the world standard, but that we need to have total dependence on Him, and not financial dependence necessarily in our own strength and abilities.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points because I think that's probably one of the most common struggles where people are crushing it at work, but maybe inwardly in their inward life, their spiritual life, maybe their marriage or relationship with their kids, they're struggling or they're not winning, or maybe they don't even really know their neighbors. It's really easy just to put the garage up, go in, and never talk to people or be engaged with people's lives. Do you think there's a way to win at work, win at home, and win in community? What would that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big part of that is to be intentional, right? I think it's challenging sometimes because everybody lives the quote unquote busy life, right? We all have so much, margin, but we choose to fill kind of our, 9 to 5 or 5 to 9 bucket, right? We choose to fill it with certain things, but yet we forget about, being intentional, with people, and, taking advantage of opportunities that God, puts you in to, make an influence upon, somebody else's life, to build a relationship with somebody, that's rooted in things like genuineness and authenticity and transparency, right? Somebody, everybody needs a trusted advisor, right? Whether or not they think they do or they don't, life is a team sport. It's a community sport, especially, for those that recognize that as in the faith-based community, we all need each other, right? We're all here to help, sharpen each other, iron sharpens iron, right? We're all here to lift each other up. We all need prayer from time to time, which I think is especially difficult for men, specifically sometimes, is to be vulnerable, with one another, be, willing to shed a tear, with one another from time to time, be willing to be transparent about some challenges maybe, that we're dealing, within each other's, life. And so I think, kind of my main, mission is really centered around kind of like Colossians, 3:23, where it talks about whatever you do, work for the Lord as working for the Lord and not for men, right? So just remember that, as we have interactions with other, people, that your work, whatever you're doing work-wise, can be a form of worship, right? Your work can be a form of worship. You can integrate God in your relationship with Christ in everything you do day in and day out, whether that's interacting with colleagues or interacting with clients or potential investors, for example, or people in your neighborhood, as an example. You can be the same person in your neighborhood as you are in church on Sunday morning.
I'm Zach Haptonstall, CEO and co-founder of Rise 48 Equity. Our goal is to help you protect and grow your wealth by investing in large multifamily apartment buildings. We do all the work as far as sourcing these large apartment buildings from the brokers, doing all of the on-site management with our vertically integrated property management company, doing all the renovations with our vertically integrated construction company. We completely rebrand the exteriors. We will renovate the interiors to our full platinum level scope, which increases the value of the asset to get that profit margin for the investors. If you'd like to learn about how you can partner with us on these exciting opportunities, and go to our website and set up a call with our team.
I think for a lot of people, they're maybe caught in a vision of trying to get to the next level of trying to reach, maybe it's financial independence, maybe it's the next promotion that they're after. But I think a lot of times one helpful exercise is just to, at the end of the year, we're coming up on start of a new year here, just to kind of slow down, evaluate, where am I at? Where do I feel like God is calling me to go? How do I use my gifts, my talents, my resources ultimately for Him? And we both work in the financial world, and we're helping a lot of people be good stewards of their money. And one of the questions I love to ask investors is, if you could zoom out 5 or 10 years from now, and your investments you're making today, will pay dividends, 2, 4, 10, 20 years down the road, what kind of impact would you want to have with your resources and with your ability to make impact with your resources? So what does that look like for you, Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always looking for, opportunities where we can, bless others. I think that's incredibly important to know that, there's going to be opportunities that God's going to put right in front of you, and you have to make a decision. Am I going to partner with that individual, in helping, them with a particular need, that they might have, or am I going to choose to look in the other direction, right? And so, I I don't normally share this very much on podcast episodes, but my wife and I, back in 2015, we felt God put a need in our lives to expand our family, and we attempted to have our third child, and we're unable to. And so we made the decision back in 2015, to open up our hearts, or allow God to open up our hearts and be open to adoption, and that really led us to adopting twins from Wuhan, China, a place that my wife and I had spent some time in college when we were teaching English in universities in Asia. And so I think that the important thing to understand is, if you want to, win at work, and you want to build up, this legacy, right? This epitaph, so to speak. I think it's important that people just recognize the opportunity that God puts out there in front, and they actually take action on it, right? there's a reason why there's a need. And if you're capable of fulfilling that need and being a blessing to another individual, sometimes God speaks through actions and not necessarily always words. And so I think it's important that we as a faith-based community, be cognizant and we recognize, different needs, in the lives of other people, and how can we partner along them, to help support them through, whatever challenge they may be facing.
Yeah, and what is that like? You've had a lot of success in your career. You've probably developed quite the arsenal of being able to bless. How do you decide which opportunities to say yes to? Is it an automatic yes to everyone? Like how do you navigate when those requests come to you?
I ask, to be honest. Sometimes I think it's important that, when we hear of particular needs out there, then it's up to us to take action on that and ask more about what that need is, right? There's lots of different examples that I could, come from, with our local church that we serve, or if it's specific missionaries out there, that I know are maybe serving, summer missions overseas, or maybe they're long-term missionaries, for example. Maybe reach out to those individuals and say, hey, just out of curiosity, how are things going on the funding side, of your, fundraising, abilities? Or, if the church is looking to, expand or repurpose, the children's wing, right? And they need to raise $1 million for that. We'll find out who's in charge of raising the money, for that specific need, and ask them, how are things going? How can I help support you, either with my time, talents, or treasures? And so I think oftentimes if the need doesn't throw itself right in front, we should be always on the guard, almost have an antenna up to see where is it that I can help, support, others and really be a blessing to them.
Yeah, that's awesome. As someone who lived on support as a college missionary for over 15 years, it's a faith walk when you are a missionary on the field. Trusting others, friends, family, churches to come up with the needs to meet your salary and benefits and ministry budget to be able to do the work that God's called you to do. And there's a verse in the Bible that I often taught people is Philippians 4:19. It says, "My God will supply all of your needs according to His glorious riches." And there's a comfort there to know that the God of the universe, who made the heavens, He made the skies, He's in control of all of the resources, and every opportunity that comes your way and every trial that comes your way. I'm just curious, in your professional working experience, can you just unpack an opportunity that was a trial that you had to use your faith to get through?
Boy, that's a good question. It's probably like literally every day. I would say that, but I just wanted to mention, you had, talked about kind of your time raising support in the mission field. I have not read this book, by the way, but I was sitting next to an 85-year-old man on an airplane 2 days ago. All right. And he was telling me about this book called The Zero Sum Game. Okay. Again, I've not read the book yet, but he kind of gave me the high level overview of it. And it really talked about, really the thesis was centered around this concept of building our treasures here on earth, versus building our treasures up in heaven, right? And so I think about, the impact of the inflationary monster that we talk about so often, right? So we can spend our entire lives building up this big nest egg, right? Only to watch that nest egg continue to get eroded every year because of the purchasing power, of the dollar continues to deteriorate, right? So you think about, the impact of $1 million as a nest egg today versus what that $1 million is going to look like in 20 years from right now. I can tell you it's going to be significantly less in 20 years from now. So that's one mindset. The other mindset is how can I use what God's given me today to make a kingdom impact upon others? How can God use the money and the treasures, that He's blessed me with to now bless others and make an impact on other people's lives, knowing that it's all going to vanish, right? Because inflation is going to deteriorate the dollar and it's going to inflate it away. What can I be doing today, right, to make a lasting legacy impact on those that are around me so that I can avoid the inflation monster deteriorating that nest egg, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I know you're a very sophisticated investor. Maybe you could just share. I think maybe I heard recently 60 deals that you've been a part of, 60 different business opportunities. Have you ever been led to make an investment that didn't make sense on paper? It didn't have the highest IRR or the best average annual return, but it was an opportunity to steward some of your capital. Have you ever had one of those experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I've invested in a lot of different things, from, hard asset multifamily to, various different asset classes. I've invested in VC backed, companies and early angel round investment opportunities. I'm always kind of looking for, what that next disruptor, is, in the business, knowing that, those investments could be they'd be anywhere from, they'd go to the moon, right? Or they'd become complete donations. So I think just from a general investing perspective, I think it's important for investors to be diversified into investments that maybe have a higher risk, higher reward, but at the same time investments that maybe carry a much smaller degree of risk. I think each individual has a different appetite for what their tolerance is when it comes to their risk profile. I just know for myself, I'm not looking to earn money because I want to have a bigger nest egg. Okay. I earn money so that I can allow my family and my extended family not just to survive but to thrive. But we also look for different areas and ways in which we can make a positive impact on the kingdom at the same time.
That's amazing. Yeah, sometimes it might not make sense, on paper, but the impact of a particular investment or a particular way to steward your resources, whether that's your time, your capital, even your relationships, can be really powerful because there's that small, still, quiet voice that is ever present in the life of a faith driven leader. That's both easy to overlook, but sometimes I've heard the phrase "listen for the whispers," because often God works in those whispers to direct us. What does that look like for you as you've had different experiences, whether it's been a career change, whether it's been a particular opportunity, a particular trial? Have you ever experienced those whispers, and what has that been like for you?
Yeah, usually those whispers aren't quite whispers. Usually they're megaphone, right? Like Jeremy, the your work life balance is not where I want it to be, right? I think about Nick. You had the opportunity to attend the ATV desert tour down in Phoenix a couple of weeks ago, and or at least you were a part of that experience. When I was on that ATV in the desert, okay, there was so much dust that I could literally not see the sun. It was almost like it was dark, right? And then we would stop the ATV so we could grab a drink of water, and all of a sudden the dust would dissipate and I could see the sun again, right? It reminds me of the fact that, sometimes our success is not to be wrapped up in our performance, but it really needs to be in our obedience to listening to Him, whether that's a whisper or whether that's a megaphone, right? And true freedom really comes from our surrender, to Him. So, in life, sometimes we need to stop, let the dust settle so we can see and experience the Son, right? Jesus Christ, the Son.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think a lot of people sometimes struggle to think about. This is something I struggle with. Is when I think about my faith, I think about Sundays, going to church, or maybe Wednesday nights. How do you integrate your faith on a daily basis in your everyday work? What could that look like for one of our listeners? What does it look like for you in your life?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not easy, right? Because, usually when we're interacting with people in general, we might have a specific, task or something that needs to get done and we get wrapped up in the work to do, right? Because that's how we are as humans, right? We have a work to do and we desire to have fulfilling work. But again, sometimes that can just mean a simple, conversation with, for example, a teenager in the hockey locker room. I had the pleasure now of being able to coach youth hockey for almost the last 15 years now. I've coached over 35 hockey teams. Some years it's been two or three teams, and some years it's been one team. but allowing me to be in that type of an environment, with the next generation, with the youth, right? It really gives me that opportunity to not only lead, those individuals by example, but also have, faith-based conversations with people every so often, right? Simply asking, one of the youth on the team, hey, does your family happen to be a part of a local church in the area, right? Or have you, ever had the opportunity, to experience God in your life? Or, having my own children there with me in the hockey locker room and having them, have those, faith-based conversations with their friends and the guys that they're playing, hockey with as well. So like I kind of talked about before, I think if we're going to bring God into our work, it really means that we need to be intentional, with having those conversations and really allowing God to use us and open up those doors and those areas of opportunities, for us to be able, to share the light of Christ with others.
Yeah, that's really good. I think in our society, it's easy to fill our calendar to have no gaps in between one into the next. And sometimes it's in those moments of just seeing your coworker getting a drink of coffee or jumping on a Zoom call and just personally connecting with some of your colleagues to just ask some of those more personal questions. What are you up to? What's been going on? What's a high and a low? I mean, it can be a very easy question that can help get to the heart of what someone is really enjoying and delighting in and what trials people are going through. I've been suffering through some eye issues this last month and a half, and I was just floored of the amount of people that reached out to me when I had a procedure this week just to check in on me. Hey, I'm wondering how you're doing. How can I pray for you? Can we bring a meal over? And sometimes it can be easy to think, these relationships are hundreds of miles away or just through social media. But taking that little extra amount of time to get to know people and really understand what's going on in their lives can really make a profound difference. And in the working world, we should know our coworkers' spouses' names and how many kids they have and the activities that they coach or the things that they do. And I think it's easy to just keep grinding. It's easy to keep making more calls, more sales, more deals closed. And, it really matters that the people you work with, your clients, really can understand where your hope can be found. And, for being a faith-driven leader, one of the best illustrations I've ever heard of is, what does grace feel like? Because I think grace ultimately is the foundation for the hope in Christ. And what does grace feel like? It's like you enter a room and you can do no wrong. That's what grace feels like. And that's a really powerful image. I mean, you gave the powerful image of the not being able to see the sun because of the dust. Imagine if we were, as faith-driven leaders, the kind of leaders that made people feel like, man, when I'm around Jeremy, when I'm around Nick, it's as if I can do no wrong. That's how they're going to treat me, and that's ultimately how Jesus treats us. He gave us this opportunity to be in fellowship with Him, and we betrayed it, and we walked away from it. We had sin, and yet He gave us an opportunity to come back to Him through a relationship with Him, ultimately through Christ, where we can be made new. The old can be tossed away, and the new can come back. So as faith-driven leaders, Jeremy, maybe one last question for you is, if someone's listening to this podcast and they're just wrestling with, man, I want to integrate my faith, and maybe I'm wrestling with purpose or calling, what would you say to them just as an encouragement?
Yeah, I would say, kind of like I had mentioned before that, if you want to have true, what I would say freedom, in Christ, you have to surrender, right? It's through your surrendering, is when that relationship with God comes alive. And when that relationship with God comes alive, you genuinely want to, tell others, as well. And you want to put yourself in a position where you can make an eternal impact, on the life of another person. So for me, and kind of, wrapping up, my story, I kind of would summarize it as, it's not when you have everything that you've achieved, freedom in life. And when I talk about freedom, it's, time and financial and location. And we like to talk about this concept of freedom all of the time, right? So it's not when you have everything that you gain an eternal freedom in Christ, but it's when you give it all to Him. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's really good. Well, any final thoughts you'd like to leave before we end the episode today?
Nick, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate the opportunity to, again, be your first guest. Looking forward to, hearing more about the guests that you're going to have on future episodes.
Yeah, there's some really powerful stories. So I'm excited to share those, and be sure to tune in. So thanks for joining in, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you for hanging out with us today and for listening to the On the Rise podcast. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on this show should be considered financial advice. Before making any financial decisions, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by the On the Rise podcast. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.